How do you measure the exact moment a man realizes he destroyed the only life that ever loved him? The chandelier light fractured across crystal and glass as Ethan Whitmore stood at the center of the ballroom, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, now unable to breathe as his world narrowed to a single figure standing across the room. She wore black, not the kind that mourned, but the kind that commanded silence, a dress that moved like shadow under gold light. And for a second, just a second, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, because Naomi Carter was supposed to be a closed chapter, a mistake filed away somewhere between his European acquisitions and the carefully curated headlines that painted him untouchable. The orchestra played something soft, something elegant, but it dissolved into nothing as his pulse filled his ears, because she wasn't alone, and the two children standing beside her, no older than 5, held themselves with a quiet stillness that felt hauntingly familiar, their eyes scanning the room with the same controlled awareness he had spent a lifetime mastering. Ethan didn't move. He couldn't. The glass in his hand trembled once before he set it down, because there are moments money cannot steady, moments where power becomes irrelevant, and this was one of them. Naomi didn't rush. She never had. She stepped forward with the kind of composure that didn't demand attention but owned it anyway. The soft click of her heels measured, unhurried, each step erasing the fragile illusion Ethan had built over the years that leaving her had been necessary, strategic, justified. The last time he had seen her, she had been standing in the doorway of a penthouse that no longer felt like home, her hand resting protectively over the life growing inside her, her eyes not crying, not begging, just watching him with a stillness that had unsettled him more than any anger ever could. And in his hand, God, he remembered it now with a clarity that burned, was a folded $20 bill. Something so small it had felt insignificant at the time, something he had told himself was temporary, symbolic, something he would fix later once Europe was handled, once the deal closed, once everything aligned. He had left before she could say anything else. He had chosen silence over responsibility, distance over truth, and somewhere between Paris boardrooms and private jets, he had convinced himself that life moved forward without consequence. But consequences, like truth, have a way of waiting in the quiet. Naomi stopped a few feet away from him now, close enough that he could see the subtle glow of her skin under the lights, the strength in her posture, the absence of anything that resembled the woman he had once thought he understood. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply looked at him the way one might look at a stranger who had no place in their story anymore. And that, more than anything, was what broke something inside him. One of the children shifted slightly, her small hand brushing against Naomi's, and Ethan's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with shock and everything to do with recognition he wasn't ready to face. The room seemed to lean in without knowing why, conversations lowering into murmurs as attention drifted toward them, drawn by something invisible but undeniable, the tension of a past colliding with a present that refused to stay buried. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came, because there was nothing in his carefully constructed vocabulary that could bridge the distance between who he had been and who she had become, nothing that could undo the image that now stood before him, complete, composed, and entirely beyond his reach. And for the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore, billionaire, strategist, untouchable force, felt something he had long forgotten how to carry. Not loss, not regret, but the quiet, undeniable realization that the life he had walked away from had not only survived without him, it had risen into something he could never control again. The silence between them stretched just long enough to become unbearable, and yet Naomi did not rush to fill it, because she no longer needed words to prove anything to a man who had once reduced her entire existence to a folded bill and a closed door, and Ethan felt it, that absence of urgency, that quiet authority that did not ask for permission or recognition. It simply existed, steady and unshaken, and it forced him to confront something far more unsettling than anger, because anger he could negotiate. Anger had terms, but this calm distance offered him nothing to hold on to, nothing to fix, nothing to control, and for a man who had built his empire on solutions, it was suffocating. Naomi, he finally said, her name unfamiliar on his tongue as if it belonged to a life he had abandoned too completely, and she tilted her head slightly, not in acknowledgement, but in polite recognition, the kind reserved for acquaintances, not history, not marriage, not the woman he had once promised forever to under lights very much like these. One of the children looked up at her then, eyes wide and curious, and she lowered her gaze with a softness that did not weaken her. It defined her, her hand brushing gently over the child's shoulder in a gesture so natural, so instinctive, that something inside Ethan tightened with a sharp clarity he could not ignore, because it was in that small, quiet moment that the truth began to take shape, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow, undeniable certainty building in the spaces between breaths. "We should not cause a scene," Naomi said, her voice even, controlled, untouched by the storm rising inside him. And it was not a request, it was a boundary, one he realized immediately he had no right to cross. Not anymore. Around them, the gala continued its elegant rhythm, champagne glasses clinking, laughter rising and falling, but it all felt distant, muted, as if the world had stepped back to give this moment the gravity it deserved, even if no one fully understood why. Ethan took a step closer, careful, hesitant in a way that would have been unthinkable to anyone who knew him. And for the first time in years, he was not calculating outcomes or measuring advantage. He was simply trying to understand the consequences of a choice he had once made without looking back. "You disappeared," he said, the words quieter now, stripped of their usual authority, and Naomi's gaze met his fully then, steady, unwavering, and for a brief second, he saw it. Not pain, not bitterness, but something far more final, acceptance that had moved beyond him entirely. "No," she replied, her tone soft but precise. "You stopped looking." The words landed without force, but they carried weight, the kind that did not need volume to be felt. And Ethan inhaled sharply as memories began to surface with uncomfortable clarity. The late nights he chose not to call, the messages he left unanswered, the way he had convinced himself distance was temporary, that everything could be resolved later, after Europe, after the deal, after everything that had seemed more urgent than the woman standing in front of him now. One of the children shifted again, this time stepping slightly forward, curiosity overcoming caution, and Ethan's gaze dropped despite himself, drawn to the familiar line of the child's features, the quiet strength in their posture, and something inside him whispered a truth he was not ready to speak aloud. "They are beautiful," he said, the words almost involuntary, and Naomi's expression did not change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, not for him, but for them, a reflection of the life she had built without him, a life that did not carry his name, his approval, or his absence as a burden. "They are mine," she said simply, and in that moment, Ethan understood the distinction, understood that whatever connection might exist biologically, emotionally, historically, it did not belong to him anymore, not in the way that mattered, not in the way that shaped identity and belonging, and the realization settled into his chest with a quiet finality that no amount of wealth or influence could undo. The music swelled gently in the background, the kind of elegant crescendo designed to elevate the night. But for Ethan, it only underscored the shift taking place in real time, the slow dismantling of a narrative he had once controlled so easily, because standing in front of him was not the woman he had left behind, and the life beside her was not something he could step back into, no matter how much he might want to rewrite the past. Naomi adjusted her grip on the child's hand, a subtle movement, protective, certain, and then she stepped past him, not brushing against him, not acknowledging him further, just moving forward with a grace that did not look back. And Ethan remained where he was, caught in the space she left behind, staring at a future that no longer included him in any way he could recognize. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened quietly as Naomi walked through them without hesitation, her pace neither hurried nor slow, just certain, and the city night greeted her with a cool, steady breeze that carried none of the weight she had just left behind, because some chapters do not end with noise, they end with a quiet step forward, and she had learned that the hardest exits are the ones where you do not turn around. Inside, Ethan remained frozen for a moment longer before instinct pulled him forward, not the confident stride that once defined him, but something uneven, something unfamiliar, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he could not quite adjust to, and by the time he reached the entrance, the distance between them had already grown, not just in steps, but in something far deeper, something irreversible. Naomi, he called again, louder this time, the name echoing slightly against the polished marble walls, and for a second, she paused, not because he asked, but because she chose to, and when she turned, it was not with expectation, not with hope, but with calm acknowledgement, the kind given to a past that no longer defines the present. The children stood close to her, one on each side, their small hands resting naturally against her, and Ethan noticed the detail with a clarity that unsettled him. The way they leaned into her presence, the way she anchored them without effort, and he realized with a sharp, quiet certainty that everything important had happened without him, every first step, every late night, every moment that builds a life from the ground up, and none of it had his name on it. "I did not know," he said, the words coming out slower now, stripped of the polished confidence that once filled every sentence he spoke. And Naomi held his gaze for a brief moment before responding, not harsh, not cold, just honest in a way that left no room for interpretation. "You did not ask," she replied, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than any accusation ever could, because it was not about what he knew or did not know. It was about what he chose not to see, not to pursue, not to value when it mattered most. The city lights reflected in the glass behind her, outlining her figure in a quiet glow that made her seem both present and untouchable, and Ethan took another step forward, stopping just short of crossing the invisible line she had drawn between them, a boundary not marked by words, but by everything that had happened in his absence. "Are they?" he began, but the question faltered before it could fully form, because some truths do not need to be spoken to be understood, and Naomi did not rush to answer. She simply looked at him with a steadiness that carried both clarity and finality. "They are loved," she said, and it was not a deflection, it was a statement of fact, one that redefined the entire conversation in a single sentence, because love, real love, had been built without him, sustained without him, and protected without ever needing his return. One of the children looked up at Ethan then, curious but unafraid, and for a fleeting second, something softened in his expression, something human beneath the layers of control and calculation, but it passed quickly, replaced by the growing realization that whatever connection might exist could not be claimed simply because he had arrived too late to understand it. "I can fix this," he said, almost instinctively, the words shaped by years of solving problems with resources and influence. But even as he spoke them, something in Naomi's expression told him he was speaking a language that no longer applied. "This is not something that is broken," she said gently, and there was no anger in her voice, no resentment, just truth, steady and unshaken. And for the first time, Ethan understood that what he was facing was not a situation to repair, but a reality to accept. A black car pulled up to the curb beside her, its engine quiet, its presence deliberate, and the driver stepped out, opening the door with a respectful nod that carried familiarity, not obligation, and Ethan noticed it, the subtle shift of power in a detail so small, it would have gone unnoticed before, but now it spoke volumes about the life she had built, the independence she had earned, the world she now belonged to. Naomi guided the children toward the car, her movements smooth, protective, certain, and before she stepped inside, she looked back one last time, not searching, not questioning, just closing a door that had already been left behind. Ethan stood there as the car door shut softly, the city lights reflecting off its surface as it pulled away, and in the quiet that followed, he was left with nothing but the echo of a truth he could no longer ignore, that some losses are not sudden. They are built slowly through absence, and by the time you realize what is gone, it no longer waits to be found. The city felt different once the car disappeared into the stream of headlights, as if something essential had been quietly removed from the night, and Ethan remained on the sidewalk longer than he should have, his hands still at his sides, his mind replaying every detail with a precision he usually reserved for contracts and negotiations. Except this time, there was no strategy, no leverage, only memory unfolding in fragments he could no longer ignore. The elevator ride back up to the ballroom was silent, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of himself he did not recognize, tailored suit, perfect posture, controlled expression, all the markers of a man who had mastered his world. Yet none of them could conceal the shift happening beneath the surface, because for the first time in years, he was not thinking about expansion, profit, or acquisition. He was thinking about absence, about a door he had closed without understanding what it contained. When the elevator doors opened, the music returned, polished and distant, and conversations resumed around him as if nothing had changed, because for everyone else, nothing had. The night was still elegant, the champagne still chilled, the deals still waiting to be discussed, but for Ethan, everything had tilted in a way that made even the familiar feel foreign. He moved through the room without purpose, nodding when spoken to, responding when necessary, but the words felt automatic, disconnected, like lines memorized long ago and delivered without meaning. And in every reflection, every passing glance, he saw it, the faint trace of something unsettled, something that could not be smoothed over by composure alone. At the edge of the ballroom, near the floor-to-ceiling windows, he stopped, the city stretching out beneath him in a grid of light and movement. And for a moment, he allowed himself to remember fully, not selectively, not strategically, but honestly, the night he left, the quiet apartment, the way Naomi had stood in the doorway with a stillness he had mistaken for weakness, the way he had placed that $20 bill into her hand as if it were enough, as if it symbolized something temporary, something manageable, and the way he had walked past her without turning back, convinced that everything important would still be there when he returned. He closed his eyes briefly. The memory sharper now, more complete, because time had removed the excuses and left only the truth, that he had not been forced, he had not been unaware, he had chosen distance, chosen convenience, chosen himself over something he did not yet understand the value of. And now that value stood in front of him in the form of two children who carried pieces of him in ways he could not claim. A voice interrupted his thoughts, smooth, familiar, one of his business partners asking about the European deal, about timelines and projections, and Ethan responded automatically, the details still intact, the numbers still precise, because success does not disappear overnight. But as the conversation continued, he realized something that unsettled him more than any loss could. The deal that had once felt like everything now felt smaller, contained, almost insignificant compared to the moment he had just lived through, and the realization settled quietly but firmly into place. When the conversation ended, he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against something unexpected, a small folded piece of paper he did not remember placing there. And when he pulled it out, his breath stilled for just a second, because it was not paper, not a receipt, not a note, but a $20 bill, crisp, untouched, almost identical to the one he had given Naomi years ago. And for a moment, the symmetry of it felt deliberate, as if the past had found its way back to him in the simplest form possible. He stared at it longer than he should have, the weight of something so small now impossibly heavy, because this time, he understood what it represented, not money, not convenience, but the exact measure of how little he had valued something that had been worth everything. And slowly, without thinking, he folded it again, his movements careful, deliberate, as if acknowledging it required a different kind of respect now. The music swelled again, the night continuing around him, but Ethan Whitmore stood at the edge of it all, holding a single piece of paper that no longer meant what it once did, realizing with a clarity he could not escape that some mistakes are not loud. They are quiet decisions made in moments that feel insignificant at the time, and by the time you understand their weight, the life they changed has already moved on without you. The night ended without ceremony, without the kind of closure Ethan had always relied on to mark transitions, and when he returned to his penthouse overlooking the city, the silence that greeted him felt different than it ever had before, not peaceful, not earned, but hollow in a way that echoed louder than any conversation he had left behind. And for the first time in years, he did not turn on the lights immediately. He simply stood there, the faint glow of the skyline outlining the familiar space that now felt strangely unfamiliar. The glass walls that once symbolized success now reflected only a single figure standing alone. And as he moved slowly through the room, his footsteps quiet against the polished floor, he noticed details he had long stopped seeing: the untouched dining table, the empty second chair, the absence of anything that suggested a shared life. And it struck him with a clarity he could not ignore that this space had never been built for anyone but himself. That even when Naomi had been here, she had existed in the margins of a life that had always prioritized everything else above her. He set the folded $20 bill down on the counter with a care that felt almost deliberate, as if placing it anywhere else would diminish the weight it now carried. And for a moment, he simply looked at it, not as currency, but as a symbol of a decision that had reshaped everything that followed. His phone buzzed on the table, messages stacking one after another, investors, partners, updates from Europe, each notification representing a world that continued to move exactly as expected, and yet none of it held his attention the way it once did, because for the first time, he understood that progress in one direction does not compensate for absence in another, that success does not replace presence. And that realization settled into him with a quiet permanence. He walked toward the window, the city stretching endlessly beneath him, lights blinking in patterns that once felt like opportunity, but now felt distant, almost detached. And as he stood there, he allowed the memory to return fully, not just the moment he left, but the moments before it, the conversations he had dismissed, the quiet strength Naomi had shown that he had mistaken for compliance. The way she had carried herself even when everything around her was uncertain, and he realized that what he had once overlooked had not been weakness, it had been resilience, the kind that builds something lasting even in the absence of support. Across the city, in a different part of the night, Naomi sat in the back seat of the car as it moved steadily through familiar streets, her reflection faint in the window beside her, the children leaning gently against her sides, their quiet presence grounding her in a way nothing else ever had. And she allowed herself a brief moment to exhale, not out of relief, but out of recognition that the past had finally aligned with the present in a way that required no further explanation. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, worn slightly at the edges, something she had carried for years without ever needing to open again. And inside it, folded carefully, was another $20 bill, the original one, the one that had marked the exact moment everything had changed, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. The point where she had been forced to choose between waiting for someone to return or becoming someone who no longer needed to be chosen. She looked at it for a second before placing it back, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with understanding, because that moment, as painful as it had also been the beginning of everything that came after, every decision, every sacrifice, every step that had led her to where she was now, sitting in quiet strength with a life that had been built intentionally, patiently, and entirely on her own terms. The car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city softening as they approached home, and Naomi rested her hand lightly over one of the children's, her gaze steady, forward, unshaken, because she no longer measured her life by what had been taken from her. She measured it by what she had created despite it, and in that difference, she had found something far more valuable than anything she had ever lost. Back in the penthouse, Ethan remained by the window long after the city began to quiet, the weight of realization settling deeper with each passing minute. And though nothing around him had changed, everything within him had shifted, because for the first time, he understood that the most significant moments in life are not always the ones that make noise. Sometimes they are the quiet decisions that redefine everything, and once made, they do not wait to be undone. Morning arrived without ceremony, the pale light of dawn stretching slowly across the glass walls of Ethan's penthouse, softening the sharp edges of a space that had always been defined by precision. And yet the calm it brought did not settle anything within him, because the realization from the night before had not faded with sleep. It had deepened, taking root in a way that refused to be ignored. He had not gone to bed, not really, only moved from one room to another as the hours passed, the city below shifting from restless motion to quiet stillness and back again. And through it all, his thoughts remained fixed on a single truth he could no longer reshape into something more comfortable. He picked up the $20 bill again, unfolding it carefully this time, smoothing out the creases as if clarity could be found in the lines, and for a moment, he saw it differently, not as something he had given, but as something that had marked the exact point where he had underestimated the strength of the woman he left behind. Across the city, Naomi's morning followed a rhythm built through years of consistency, not luxury, not excess, but intention, and as sunlight filtered gently through the windows of her home, the children moved through their routines with quiet familiarity, laughter soft and unforced, the kind that comes from security rather than circumstance, and she watched them with a calm presence that carried both warmth and strength, her attention steady, her priorities clear. There were no grand gestures here, no dramatic moments, only the quiet accumulation of days lived with purpose, and in that simplicity, something far more powerful had been built than anything that could be purchased or displayed. Ethan stood in his kitchen, the city reflected faintly in the polished surface of the counter, and for the first time in years, he found himself questioning not what he had achieved, but what he had overlooked, the spaces between milestones, the relationships he had assumed would remain unchanged regardless of his choices. And he understood now that absence is not neutral, it is active, it reshapes everything it touches, often without warning, often without reversal. He reached for his phone, scrolling through contacts that once felt like a network of influence, and paused at her name, still there, unchanged, as if time had not moved at all, and yet everything about its meaning had shifted, because calling her was no longer about reclaiming something lost. It was about acknowledging something he no longer had the right to expect. He hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding, because some conversations cannot begin where they once left off, and some silences cannot be undone with a single attempt at repair. Across the table, the children finished their breakfast, their voices light, their presence grounding the space in a way that did not require explanation, and Naomi moved with quiet efficiency, gathering small details, adjusting a sleeve, brushing a strand of hair away from one of their faces, each action simple, each one carrying the weight of years spent building a life that did not depend on anyone else's return. She glanced at the clock briefly, then reached for her bag, the envelope still inside, untouched, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer defined anything about who she had become. Back in the penthouse, Ethan lowered his phone slowly, placing it on the counter beside the folded bill, the two objects sitting there in silent contrast, one representing a past decision, the other a present hesitation, and for the first time, he did not rush to resolve either, because he understood now that not everything can be fixed through action alone. Some things require acceptance, patience, and the willingness to face what has already been set in motion. The city continued to wake around him, cars moving, lights shifting, life unfolding in its usual rhythm. But for Ethan, the pace had changed, not externally, but internally, because he was no longer moving ahead without reflection. He was standing still long enough to understand the cost of where he had been, and in that stillness, something unfamiliar began to form, not control, not certainty, but awareness, the kind that does not offer immediate answers, only the truth, clear and unavoidable, that the life he once left behind had not waited for him to return. It had grown into something complete on its own. By mid-morning, the city had fully awakened, but for Ethan, time still felt slightly out of sync, as if the rhythm he had followed for years no longer aligned with the pace of his own thoughts. And instead of heading into his usual sequence of meetings and decisions, he found himself standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window once again, the skyline no longer a symbol of control, but a reminder of everything that had continued without him noticing what truly mattered. He had always believed that distance was temporary, that anything left behind could be returned to when the timing was right. But now he understood that time does not pause for convenience. It moves forward with or without permission, and the life Naomi had built had not waited for his return. It had evolved beyond it. His phone vibrated again. Another call, another opportunity demanding attention, and for the first time, he declined it without hesitation. The silence that followed not uncomfortable, but necessary, because there were moments when stepping away was the only way to see clearly, and clarity was something he could no longer afford to ignore. Across town, Naomi walked beside her children along a quiet sidewalk lined with early spring trees, their leaves just beginning to return, soft green against the pale sky, and the air carried a gentle warmth that hinted at change without urgency, the kind of change that happens gradually, steadily, without announcement, much like the life she had built over the years. One of the children laughed at something small, something simple, and Naomi smiled, the expression natural, unguarded, not because life had been easy, but because she had learned how to create peace within it, how to build something stable even when everything had once been uncertain. She did not rush through her days anymore. She moved with intention, choosing what mattered and letting the rest fall away. And in that choice, she had found a balance that no longer depended on anyone else's presence or approval. Ethan finally turned away from the window, the decision forming not as a plan, but as a quiet understanding that something needed to shift, not externally, not in the way he had always operated, but internally, in the way he measured value, in the way he approached what could not be quantified or controlled. And he reached for his coat, not for a meeting, not for a negotiation, but for something far less defined, something that required him to step outside the structure he had always relied on. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual, each floor passing with a soft chime that echoed more than it should have. And when the doors opened to the street, the noise of the city greeted him fully, unfiltered, real in a way that felt grounding rather than overwhelming. And for the first time in a long while, he did not move with urgency. He walked, slower, more aware, noticing details he had long overlooked, the rhythm of footsteps, the fragments of conversation, the quiet interactions that made up lives beyond his own. Somewhere in the distance, he caught sight of a familiar street, one he had not visited in years, not because it had disappeared, but because he had chosen not to return. And now, standing at the edge of it, he hesitated only briefly before stepping forward, not with expectation, not with entitlement, but with a recognition that understanding does not come from staying where you are comfortable. It comes from facing what you have avoided. The buildings looked smaller than he remembered, the sidewalks narrower, but the significance of the place had not changed, because this was where everything had shifted, where a decision had been made without fully understanding its weight. And now, as he moved closer, he felt that weight more clearly than ever before. At the same time, Naomi reached the end of her street, her home coming into view with a quiet familiarity that held none of the emptiness she had once known. And as she unlocked the door, the children moving ahead of her with ease, she paused for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because she knew that the past had resurfaced in a way she could not ignore. But she also knew that it no longer held power over the life she had created. And with that understanding, she stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her, not as an escape, but as a choice, a continuation of everything she had built, steady, intentional, and entirely her own. The street had not changed as much as Ethan expected, but something about it felt smaller now, not because it had diminished, but because his perspective had shifted. And as he stood across from the building where everything had once unraveled, he realized that time does not preserve places the way memory does. It reshapes them quietly, leaving only fragments of what once felt permanent. The entrance looked the same, the worn steps, the modest glass door, the faint reflection of the city moving behind him. And for a moment, he hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, because this was not just a location. It was a point of consequence, a place where a decision had been made without understanding its weight. And now that weight followed him here with a clarity he could no longer ignore. He stepped inside slowly, the air cooler than outside, carrying the faint scent of something familiar, something grounded. And as he moved toward the elevator, he noticed how quiet everything was, not empty, but lived in, steady, unremarkable in a way that felt almost foreign compared to the controlled precision of his own environment. The elevator doors opened with a soft sound, and as he stepped inside, he caught his reflection again. But this time, he did not look away, because there was no version of himself he could return to without acknowledging the one standing here now. And as the elevator rose, each floor marking a gradual return to a past he had long avoided, he felt something settle within him, not resolution, but acceptance of what he might find. Across the city, Naomi moved through her home with the same quiet rhythm she had built over years, the children settling into their activities, their voices filling the space with a lightness that did not require attention to be meaningful. And she paused briefly at the window, her gaze drifting outward, not searching, not expecting, just aware, because there are moments when the past approaches without warning, and even when it holds no power, it still carries presence. The sound of a distant door closing echoed faintly in the building, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but something about it drew her attention. Not fear, not concern, just recognition that something beyond her routine had shifted, and she stood still for a moment, listening, not for confirmation, but for understanding. Back in the hallway, Ethan stepped out of the elevator, the corridor stretching quietly before him, each door identical, each one holding a life he knew nothing about. And as he moved forward, his steps slowed, not because he did not know where to go, but because he did, and the certainty of it carried a weight that could not be rushed. He stopped in front of a door he remembered too clearly, the number unchanged, the surface simple, unmarked by anything that would suggest the years that had passed, and for a moment, he did nothing, his hand hovering just slightly before lowering again, because he understood now that knocking was not just an action, it was a statement, an acknowledgement that he was stepping into something he no longer controlled. Inside, Naomi turned slightly, her attention shifting from the window toward the door, not because she heard a sound, but because something within her recognized the moment before it fully arrived, the quiet awareness that the past had not disappeared, it had simply waited until it could be faced without fear. The children continued their quiet play, unaware of the shift unfolding, their world steady, protected, untouched by what stood on the other side of the door, and Naomi took a slow breath, not to prepare, not to steady herself, but to acknowledge that whatever came next would not change what she had built, it would only reveal what had already been decided. In the hallway, Ethan finally raised his hand again, this time without hesitation, and as his knuckles met the door in a soft, deliberate knock, the sound carried more than presence. It carried recognition, responsibility, and the quiet understanding that some moments are not about reclaiming what was lost, but about facing the truth of why it was lost in the first place. The sound of the knock lingered in the quiet space between them, soft but undeniable, and for a brief moment, nothing moved, as if time itself had chosen to pause out of respect for what stood on either side of that door, a past unresolved and a present already decided. Naomi did not rush to answer, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity, because she understood that opening the door was not about letting him in. It was about acknowledging that he had finally arrived at a place he once walked away from without looking back. She moved toward the door with steady steps, each one grounded, unhurried, her hand reaching for the handle with the same calm certainty that had defined every choice she had made since that day years ago. And when she opened it, the space between them closed in a way that felt both immediate and distant at the same time. Ethan stood there, not as the man who had left, not even as the man who had returned from Europe with power and certainty, but as someone stripped of all the layers he once relied on, his presence quieter now, his posture less defined by control and more by awareness. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because some truths do not need to be introduced, they exist fully the moment they are faced. The hallway light framed him in a way that made everything clear without words, the distance, the years, the decisions that had shaped both of them into people who no longer shared the same life. And Naomi held his gaze without resistance, without invitation, just acknowledgement of what stood before her. "I remember everything," he said finally, his voice steady but softer than it had ever been, not rehearsed, not calculated, just honest in a way that carried no expectation. And Naomi listened, not because she needed to hear it, but because she understood that sometimes the truth must be spoken, even if it changes nothing. "So do I," she replied, her tone even, her expression unchanged, because memory had never been the issue. It was what had been done with it that defined everything that followed. Behind her, the faint sound of the children's laughter drifted through the space, light and unguarded, a reminder of a life that had been built without interruption, without waiting, and Ethan heard it too, his eyes shifting briefly, not searching, not claiming, just recognizing the reality he stood outside of. He took a slow breath, not to prepare, but to accept, because for the first time, he understood that this moment was not about asking for anything, not forgiveness, not return, not even understanding. It was about standing in front of the consequence of a choice he had once made too easily. "I cannot change what I did," he said, the words simple, unembellished, and for once, they did not sound like a limitation. They sounded like truth, and Naomi nodded slightly, not in agreement, not in approval, but in recognition that he had finally reached the point where excuses no longer held value. "No," she said gently, "you cannot." And there was no harshness in her voice, only certainty, because she had already lived through the outcome of that truth. She had already built something beyond it, something that did not require it to be undone. The space between them remained unchanged, not closing, not widening, just steady, defined by everything that had been and everything that would not be. And Ethan understood then that this was not a door he had come to reopen. It was a door he had come to stand in front of and understand why it had closed in the first place. He reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out the folded $20 bill, holding it for a second before extending it slightly, not as an offering, not as a gesture of repair, but as acknowledgement of what it had once represented. And Naomi looked at it briefly before meeting his gaze again, her expression calm, unshaken. "Keep it," she said softly. "You will need it more than I ever did." And the words did not carry sarcasm or bitterness. They carried truth, the kind that does not need to wound to be understood. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, the weight of that small piece of paper heavier than anything he had ever held. And in that moment, he understood fully that what he had lost was not something that could be measured, replaced, or reclaimed. It was something that had grown beyond him, something that no longer belonged to the life he had chosen. Naomi stepped back slightly, not retreating, not closing herself off, just creating space where it already existed. And as the door began to close gently between them, there was no dramatic finality, no raised voices, no lingering questions, only the quiet completion of something that had already ended long before this moment arrived. And as the door clicked softly into place, Ethan remained standing in the hallway, not waiting, not hoping, just present, finally understanding that the most powerful form of justice is not revenge. It is a life lived fully without the person who once chose to leave it behind.